On the morning of March 3, 1943, a Japanese admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the sky with growing unease. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded a convoy of 16 ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops across the Bismarck Sea. His mission was critical: deliver reinforcements to New Guinea before Allied forces could intercept them. Japanese staff officers had calculated the odds at 50-50. They expected to lose perhaps 4 transports. What happened next would exceed their worst nightmares. 700 miles to the south, at an airfield carved out of the New Guinea jungle, a 53-year-old American general named George Kenney was waiting. For months he had been preparing for exactly this moment. He had trained his pilots in a bombing technique that conventional military experts dismissed as suicidal, flying at 200 feet above the waves, releasing bombs that would skip across the water like stones thrown by a child, slamming into the sides of ships at point-blank range. The established doctrine said it could not be done. Too dangerous. Too reckless. The pilots would be slaughtered by anti-aircraft fire before they ever reached their targets. Kenney believed the experts were wrong. In the next 15 minutes, he would prove it. The misjudgment of skip bombing began years before the first bomb ever skipped across water. Military aviation doctrine in the 1930s and early 1940s was built on a single foundational belief: high-altitude precision bombing would win wars. The United States Army Air Forces had invested everything in this concept. They developed the Norden bombsight, a classified instrument so secret that bombardiers were required to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The Norden could supposedly drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. Generals built their careers on this promise. Entire strategies depended on it. The reality was far different. Under combat conditions, with anti-aircraft fire bursting around them, with fighters attacking from every angle, with clouds obscuring targets and winds pushing bombs off course, American bombardiers were lucky to land anything within 1,200 feet of their aim point. The supposedly miraculous Norden bombsight required stable level flight for accurate bomb release, but stable level flight made bombers perfect targets. Pilots had to choose between accuracy and survival usually won. Against ships, the problem was even worse. A ship at sea could change course the moment it saw bombs falling. It took many seconds for a bomb dropped from high altitude to reach the water. In those seconds, a skilled captain could turn his vessel far enough to avoid the impact point. The hit rate for high-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships dropped to barely 1%. For every 100 bombs dropped, 99 splashed harmlessly into the sea. The numbers were damning. During the early months of 1942, American bombers flew hundreds of sorties against Japanese shipping in the Southwest Pacific. They dropped thousands of bombs. They hit almost nothing. In January 1943, a Japanese convoy successfully delivered troops to Lae, New Guinea, despite 416 Allied bombing sorties. The bombers dropped their loads from high altitude following established doctrine, doing everything they had been trained to do. 2 ships were sunk. The other transports got through. Japanese ground strength in New Guinea continued to grow while American bombers flew mission after futile mission. The British had discovered an alternative in the opening days of the war. On September 4, 1939, just one day after Britain declared war on Germany, 15 Bristol Blenheim bombers attacked German warships near Wilhelmshaven. They flew at 100 feet above the waves and released their bombs at close range. The bombs skipped across the water and struck the ships. It worked. The physics were sound. A bomb released at low altitude retained the forward momentum of the aircraft. If it struck the water at the right angle, it would bounce like a flat stone thrown by a skilled hand. But the cost was devastating. 5 bombers were shot down in that single attack. The anti-aircraft fire at low altitude was murderous. Every gun on every ship could engage aircraft flying at 100 feet. The pilots had no time to evade, no room to maneuver. They flew straight into the teeth of the enemy defences. British commanders looked at those casualties and made a decision that would shape Allied doctrine for years. Skip bombing was too dangerous. The technique was effective, but the losses were unsustainable. They abandoned it entirely and returned to high-altitude attacks that rarely hit anything, but at least gave the crews a chance of coming home. This conclusion spread through Allied military thinking like an infection. Too dangerous. The phrase became an article of faith when American planners considered low-altitude attacks against shipping. They were told the same thing British commanders had concluded. The aircraft would be destroyed before they could release their bombs. The pilots would die for nothing. Better to bomb from high altitude where at least the crews had a chance of survival, even if the bombs almost never struck their targets. The experts who made these pronouncements were not fools. They were experienced military professionals drawing reasonable conclusions from available evidence. The British losses at Wilhelmshaven were real. Anti-aircraft fire at low altitude was genuinely deadly. A bomber flying straight and level toward a ship at 200 feet was an easy target for every gun on deck. The machine guns, the light cannons, the heavy anti-aircraft batteries, all of them could engage a target at that altitude. The bomber had perhaps 30 seconds of exposure time before reaching the target. 30 seconds in which dozens of guns could pour fire into a single aircraft. But the analysis contained a fatal flaw. The experts assumed the problem was unsolvable. They looked at the British failure and concluded that low-altitude bombing against ships would always be suicidal. They never asked whether the technique could be improved. They never questioned whether aircraft could be modified to suppress that anti-aircraft fire. They never explored whether tactics could be developed to reduce the exposure time, to divide the defenders' attention, to give the bombers a fighting chance of getting through. They saw a problem and declared it impossible. They were wrong about everything. The transformation began with a man who refused to accept conventional wisdom. George Churchill Kenney was born on August 6, 1889, in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, during his American parents' summer vacation. They had come north to escape the summer heat of Boston. The boy they brought into the world would spend his career generating heat of a different kind. Kenney stood approximately 5'5", a compact man with boundless energy and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. He had a quick mind and a quicker temper, and he never hesitated to tell superiors when he thought they were wrong. This trait did not always endear him to his commanders, but it made him exactly the kind of officer who could challenge established doctrine. He attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology intermittently from 1907 to 1911, studying civil engineering. Financial hardship forced him to leave when his father abandoned the family. The young Kenney had to support his mother and siblings, taking whatever work he could find. He never forgot the lesson of those years. Sometimes you had to improvise. Sometimes the conventional path was not available. Sometimes you had to find another way. Kenney found his calling in aviation. He enlisted in the aviation section of the Signal Corps in 1917 and quickly proved himself an exceptional pilot. During the First World War, he flew 75 combat missions with the 91st Aero Squadron over France. He shot down 2 German aircraft and survived being shot down himself once. He earned the Silver Star and the Distinguished Service Cross, the latter presented personally by Brigadier General Billy Mitchell on January 10, 1919. Between the wars, Kenney became the Air Corps' foremost advocate of attack aviation. While others focused on strategic bombing of distant targets, Kenney championed the use of aircraft to support ground troops, to attack enemy supply lines, to strike targets of immediate tactical value. This put him at odds with the dominant thinking in the Army Air Forces, which was committed to the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing. Kenney was swimming against the current, and he knew it. In 1928, while teaching at the Air Corps Tactical School at Langley Field, Virginia, Kenney developed the theoretical concept of skip bombing. He understood the physics. A bomb released at low altitude from a fast-moving aircraft would retain the plane's forward momentum. If it struck the water at the right angle, it would bounce like a skipping stone, traveling forward until it hit the side of a ship. The underwater explosion would be devastating because water does not compress. The full force of the blast would concentrate against the hull rather than dissipating harmlessly into the air. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. High-altitude bombs struck the deck of a ship where armor was thickest. Skip bombs struck the side of a ship where armor was typically much thinner. High-altitude bombs often punched through a deck and out the hull before exploding, limiting their damage. Skip bombs detonated underwater against the weakest part of the hull, maximizing destruction. The physics favored the skip bomber, but the concept sat dormant for 14 years. The Army Air Forces had committed themselves to high-altitude precision bombing, and Kenney was a voice crying in the wilderness. His ideas were filed away and forgotten. Then came December 7, 1941, and suddenly everything changed. In July 1942, Kenney received a telephone call from General Henry Hap Arnold, ordering him to Washington for a new assignment. Douglas MacArthur needed a new air commander in the Southwest Pacific, and MacArthur had been offered a choice between Kenney and Jimmy Doolittle, the hero of the famous Tokyo raid. MacArthur rejected Doolittle as nothing more than a showboat and chose Kenney instead. Kenney arrived in Brisbane, Australia on July 28, 1942. His first meeting with MacArthur was not encouraging. The Supreme Commander delivered a lecture lasting approximately an hour on the shortcomings of the Air Force in general and his previous air commanders in particular. MacArthur had been disappointed by air power, and he wanted Kenney to know it. Kenney listened without interrupting. When MacArthur finished, Kenney made him a simple promise. "Give me time to assess the situation, and I will show you what air power can really do." MacArthur agreed to wait. What Kenney found in the Southwest Pacific appalled him. His aircraft were being wasted in piecemeal attacks that accomplished nothing. Bombers were sent out in ones and twos, making it easy for Japanese fighters to destroy them. Crews were demoralized by missions that seemed pointless. Commanders were fighting the last war, applying European theater tactics to a Pacific theater that required entirely different approaches. And Japanese convoys were moving reinforcements to New Guinea almost at will. High-altitude bombing could not stop them. The bombers flew over, dropped their loads, watched the bombs miss, and flew home. Meanwhile, Japanese troops poured into positions that threatened Australia itself. Kenney knew there had to be a better way. He remembered his 1928 concept, and at airfields around Brisbane, Australia, he found the man who could make it work. Paul Irvin Gunn was born on October 18, 1899, in Quitman, Arkansas, a small town in the Ozark foothills. He was one of 6 children of a blacksmith named Nathaniel Hezekiah Gunn, and he grew up knowing how to work with his hands. He enlisted in the Navy as a young man and spent 21 years in service, rising to Chief Petty Officer, the highest enlisted rank. He learned to fly during his Navy years and discovered a gift for understanding aircraft, not just how to fly them, but how they worked, how to fix them, how to make them do things their designers never intended. Gunn retired from the Navy in December 1939 and moved to Hawaii to start a charter flying service. When that venture failed, he moved to the Philippines and established an airline there. He was in Manila with his wife and 4 children when the Japanese attacked on December 8, 1941. Gunn escaped, His family did not. They were captured on January 20th, 1942, and imprisoned at the Santo Tomas internment camp at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. They would remain there for more than 3 years, enduring hunger, disease, and the constant threat of Japanese brutality. Gunn knew they were there. He knew what they were suffering, and that knowledge burned in him every single day. Everyone called him Pappy because at 43 he was decades older than the young pilots he served with. Most of them were in their early 20s. Gunn was old enough to be their father, and in many ways he became exactly that. He looked after them, taught them, and bullied them into becoming better pilots and mechanics. He had a volcanic temper and absolutely no patience for military bureaucracy or for anyone who got between him and his mission. According to oft-repeated legend, Gunn once drew a gun on a supply officer in Melbourne who refused to give him Dutch bomb sights he needed for his aircraft. Whether the story was true or embellished, it captured something essential about his character. Pappy Gunn would do whatever it took to kill the enemy who held his family prisoner. Rules, regulations, chains of command, these were obstacles to be overcome, not principles to be obeyed. Kenney discovered Gunn at Brisbane in August 1942. Gunn had been modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers entirely on his own initiative at Eagle Farm and Amberley Field, without orders, without authorization, without anyone telling him to do it. He had installed 4 .50 caliber machine guns in the nose of the A-20s, using weapons salvaged from wrecked P-39 and P-40 fighters that littered airfields across Australia. The standard A-20 had a glass-nosed bombardier compartment suitable for level bombing from altitude. It was useless for low-altitude attack because the bombardier sitting in that glass nose would be the first to die when the anti-aircraft fire began. Gunn's modification replaced the glass nose with a solid nose packed with guns. The aircraft could now strafe enemy ships, suppressing their anti-aircraft crews during a bombing run. Kenney immediately recognized the implications. This was the piece he had been missing. Skip bombing was too dangerous because the anti-aircraft fire would destroy the bombers before they could release their weapons. But what if the bombers could suppress that anti-aircraft fire themselves? What if they could sweep the decks with thousands of rounds of machine gun fire, killing the gunners, destroying the weapons, forcing the defenders to take cover while the bombs skipped across the water and slammed into the hull? Kenney made Gunn his special projects officer on the spot and ordered 16 more A-20s modified. Then he gave Gunn a bigger challenge, the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 was a capable aircraft with good range and payload, but like the A-20, it had a glass nose designed for a bombardier. Kenney wanted the bombardier removed entirely. He wanted the nose filled with forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. His instructions to Gunn were characteristically direct. Pull the bomb sight and bombardier out of the nose and fill the place full of as many .50 caliber guns as he could squeeze in there. Working with Jack Fox, a North American aviation field representative who had been sent to Australia to support the aircraft, Gunn began transforming B-25s into what they called commerce destroyers. It was not easy work. The first prototype was so nose-heavy with the added guns that it would not fly properly. Gunn nicknamed it Pappy's Folly and went back to work. He solved the weight problem by relocating the gun pods farther aft along the fuselage and repositioning the internal fuel tank. He removed the ventral turret to save weight. He installed 4 .50 caliber machine guns in a solid nose compartment, then added 4 more in streamlined pods mounted on the sides of the fuselage, 2 on each side. With the top turret rotated forward, a modified B-25 could bring 8 to 10 .50 caliber machine guns to bear on a target directly ahead. Each .50 caliber machine gun fired approximately 750 to 850 rounds per minute. With 8 guns firing simultaneously, A B-25 strafer could pour more than 6,000 rounds per minute into a target. At close range, this was devastating firepower. Deck crews caught in that storm of bullets had no chance. Anti-aircraft guns were destroyed. Ammunition-ready lockers exploded. Bridge windows shattered. Anyone caught in the open died instantly. By the end of February 1943, 12 modified B-25s were ready for combat. Gunn named his personal aircraft out of stock because he had assembled it from parts that supply officers kept telling him were unavailable. He had scrounged, bargained, and stolen what he needed from bases across Australia. The combination of strafing and skip bombing was devastating in concept. The strafer B-25s would approach a ship at masthead height, their guns blazing, sweeping the decks and suppressing the anti-aircraft crews. Behind them, or alongside them, came the skip bombers, releasing their weapons at 200 to 230 miles per hour from an altitude of 200 feet. The bombs, fitted with 4 to 5 second delay fuses, would skip across the water, slam into the side of the ship, sink below the waterline, and detonate. The delay fuse was critical. Without it, the bomb would explode on contact with the water, and the blast would destroy the attacking aircraft along with its crew. With the delay, the pilot had time to roar past the target and escape before the bomb went off. Captain Ken McCullough, one of the first skip bombing practitioners, explained the technique. He would fly directly over the ship, retaining the same airspeed and altitude. With the 4 to 5 second delay fuse in the bomb, he had time to get away while the bomb sank by the side of the ship. The explosion underwater often broke the ship in half and created almost immediate fire and explosions. Kenney personally observed skip bombing practice at Port Moresby on September 20th, 1942. McCullough demonstrated the technique against the wreck of a cargo ship called the Pruth. He skipped 6 out of 10 bombs into the target, a hit rate that would have been impossible from high altitude. Kenney ordered Major William Benn to teach skip bombing to all the pilots in his squadron and to use the tactics against Japanese ships at the first opportunity. The training was intensive and dangerous. Pilots practiced approaching targets at masthead height, timing their bomb releases to the split second, pulling up and away before the delayed explosion could catch them. The technique required nerve as much as skill. Flying straight at a target 200 feet above the water left no margin for error. Any mistake meant death, but the pilots learned and they grew confident in their ability to execute the tactics under combat conditions. The first American combat skip bombing mission came on October 22 and 23, 1942, when 6 B-17s attacked Japanese ships at Rabaul. Captain Franklin Greene became the first successful American skip bomber, hitting a light cruiser and 2 cargo ships. The technique worked. Now Kenney needed to prove it could work on a massive scale. In late February 1943, Allied intelligence detected a major Japanese convoy preparing to depart Rabaul. Naval codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington had decrypted Japanese communications, revealing the convoy's intended destination and approximate arrival date. The destination was Lae, New Guinea. The cargo was the main body of the 51st Division, nearly 7,000 troops who would reinforce Japanese positions and threaten Allied operations throughout the region. If those reinforcements arrived, the balance of power in New Guinea would shift decisively in Japan's favour. The timing was critical for both sides. The Japanese had just been defeated at Guadalcanal, withdrawing their forces in early February. They had also lost ground at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda on the New Guinea coast. Their position was deteriorating, and fresh troops at Lae could stabilise the front and enable a counter-offensive. For the Allies, intercepting this convoy was not merely desirable, it was essential. Japanese planners knew the convoy faced serious risk. They conducted war games that predicted losses of 4 out of 10 transports and 30 to 40 aircraft. The odds were roughly 50-50, but the alternative was worse. Landing at Madang and marching 140 miles through jungle, swamps and mountains would take months and cost even more lives to disease and starvation. The convoy would sail. The Japanese assembled 16 ships. 8 transports carried the troops, supplies and equipment. The transports were the Kyokusei Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Ayo Maru and Kembu Maru. The largest was Nojima Maru at over 8,000 tons, carrying 400 naval infantry. The smallest was Kembu Maru at less than 1,000 tons, loaded with aviation fuel that would turn her into a floating bomb if hit. 8 destroyers provided escort: the Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Arashio, Asashio, Shikinami, Uranami, Yukikaze, and Asagumo. The troops crowded aboard these ships were not raw recruits. The 51st Division had been formed in Manchuria and had combat experience. They were being sent to reinforce a deteriorating situation in New Guinea, where Allied forces were pushing back against Japanese positions. The men knew they faced danger. What they did not know was that they were sailing into a trap that would be sprung with a weapon they had never encountered. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the 18th Army, sailed aboard the destroyer Tokitsukaze. The convoy departed Simpson Harbour, Rabaul, around midnight on the night of February 28 to March 1, 1943. They took the northern route around New Britain, hoping to use storm cover for protection against Allied reconnaissance. Kenney had been preparing for exactly this scenario. His reconnaissance aircraft were watching for any major convoy movement. On the afternoon of March 1, a B-24 Liberator broke through the clouds at approximately 3 in the afternoon and spotted the convoy steaming west. The pilot reported the sighting, and Kenney activated his attack plan. The assault would combine every innovation Kenney had developed over the previous months. High-altitude bombers would strike first, forcing the ships to maneuver and break formation. Australian Beaufighters would simulate torpedo attacks, causing the ships to turn and expose their broadsides. Then the skip bombers and strafers would come in at masthead height and destroy everything that floated. On March 2, weather-limited operations. Low clouds and rain squalls obscured the convoy for much of the day, providing the protection Japanese planners had hoped for. But the weather was not constant. Gaps appeared in the cloud cover, and through those gaps came the bombers. 8 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked from medium altitude around 11 in the morning, dropping 1,000-pound bombs from 5,000 feet. Japanese fighters rose to intercept, and the bombers fought their way through without escort, their gunners trading fire with Zeros that slashed through the formation. The bombing was difficult in the poor visibility, but one bomb found its mark. The transport Kyokusei Maru, carrying approximately 1,225 troops of the 51st Division, took a direct hit. The 1,000-pound bomb punched through her deck and detonated deep in the hull. The ship broke in half almost instantly, the two sections separating and sinking within minutes. Soldiers who had been below decks had no chance. Those topsides scrambled for lifeboats or jumped into the water. Destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo rushed to rescue survivors, pulling about 950 men from the sea. But several hundred went down with the ship, the first casualties of what would become a massacre. It was an encouraging start, but conventional bombing had achieved only 1 kill from 8 aircraft. The real test would come the next day. March 3, 1943, dawned clear over the Bismarck Sea. The weather that had protected the convoy was gone. The Japanese were approximately 50 miles southeast of Finschhafen, steaming toward Leh at perhaps 7 knots. They expected to arrive that night. Admiral Kimura must have felt relief that the worst of the journey was nearly over. He was wrong. The worst was about to begin. The Allied aircraft assembled over Cape Ward Hunt at approximately 9:30 in the morning. Major Ed Larner, commanding the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group, shouted to his crews the words that would begin one of the most devastating air attacks in military history. Cape Ward Hunt 0930. Let's go. 13. B-17s struck first, bombing from 7,000 feet. Their purpose was not to sink ships, but to force evasive maneuvers that would disrupt the convoy formation and keep the Japanese looking up while the real attack approached at wave top level. Then came 13 Australian Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. They swept in at mast height, engines roaring, and the Japanese captains saw them coming. The silhouette of a Beaufighter approaching low over the water looked exactly like a torpedo bomber. Standard doctrine called for turning toward a torpedo attack to present the smallest possible target. A torpedo had to hit the side of a ship to be effective. If you turned your bow toward it, the torpedo would pass harmlessly alongside. Every ship in the convoy turned toward the approaching Beaufighters. It was exactly what Kenney wanted. The Beaufighters were not carrying torpedoes. They were armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. They raked the ships with devastating fire as they roared past, their shells tearing into deck crews and anti-aircraft positions. The gunners, who should have been defending against the next wave of attackers, were dead or diving for cover. Behind the Beaufighters came 12 B-25 strafers, led by Major Larner. They approached at 25 to 100 feet above the water, their 8 forward guns blazing. Each aircraft was pouring thousands of rounds into the ships, sweeping the decks, silencing the few anti-aircraft guns that still fired. Captain Jock Hennebury, leading the second element in Larner's formation, watched his commander make the first skip bombing run. Everybody was rather apprehensive, Hennebury recalled later, when everybody saw him make that pass and hit it with at least 1, and maybe 2, and the explosion that just ignited the whole thing. The guys got the idea that if he could do it, they could do it. The B-25s swept through the convoy, their guns tearing apart superstructures and bridge houses, their bombs skipping across the water and slamming into holes below the waterline. Behind them came 12 A-20 Havocs with more skip bombs. The coordinated assault was overwhelming. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. The attack lasted approximately 15 minutes. In that quarter hour, the Japanese convoy was annihilated. Every remaining transport was hit. Ships that had been steaming toward Lae were now burning, listing, sinking. The Teiyo Maru, the Nojima Maru, the Oigawa Maru, the Shinai Maru, the Taimei Maru, the Ayo Maru, the Kembu Maru, all of them were struck by skip bombs that crashed through their hulls below the waterline. The Kembu Maru, loaded with aviation fuel, exploded in a fireball that could be seen for miles. 3 destroyers were destroyed or going down. The flagship Shirayuki suffered a magazine explosion that broke her stern away. Admiral Kimura, wounded by shrapnel, transferred to the surviving destroyer Shikinami. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were in the water, struggling among the oil and debris, calling for help that came too slowly for most of them. The statistics told the story of skip bombing's vindication. Major Larner's squadron dropped 37 bombs and scored 17 direct hits, a hit rate of 46%. Overall, the low-level attacks achieved a hit rate of approximately 35%. The medium-altitude attacks by the B-17s achieved less than 8%. Skip bombing was not merely effective, it was transformative. A technique dismissed as suicidal had achieved a hit rate 35 times higher than conventional high-altitude bombing. The established doctrine had been proven catastrophically wrong. One tragedy marred the Allied victory that day. AB-17, nicknamed Double Trouble, was hit by anti-aircraft fire during the attack and caught fire. 7 crew members bailed out, their parachutes opening against the smoke-filled sky. Japanese Zero fighters that had been largely ineffective against the low-flying attackers spotted the helpless men descending. They swept in and machine-gunned the Americans in their parachutes. Allied pilots witnessed the atrocity. 3 P-38 pilots engaged the Japanese fighters in a furious dogfight and were shot down, though they destroyed 5 enemy aircraft before they fell. The murder of the parachuting crewmen would be remembered and would contribute to a grim decision the following day. The killing continued on March 4. The destroyer Asashio, stopped in the water while picking up survivors from the sunken Arashio, was struck by a B-17 bomb and sank. The Tokitsukaze, disabled the previous day, was sunk in the early afternoon by a flight of 9 B-25 bombers. American PT boats patrolling the area at night torpedoed and sank the crippled transport Oigawa Maru. 4 surviving destroyers escaped to Rabaul. Of the 16 ships that had departed Simpson Harbor, 12 were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. All 8 transports were gone. 4 of 8 destroyers were destroyed. The human cost was staggering. Of nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who embarked on the convoy, approximately 3,000 died. Many drowned when their ships sank. Others were killed by bombs and strafing. Still others died in the water, wounded and unable to swim, or succumbing to exhaustion and exposure as they waited for rescue that came too slowly or not at all. About 2,700 survivors were rescued by the surviving destroyers and returned to Rabaul. These men had lost everything: their weapons, their equipment, and their units. They arrived back at the base they had left days earlier, shocked and demoralized, living testimony to the disaster that had befallen the convoy. Only 800 to 1,200 troops ever reached Leh, most of them transported by destroyers before those ships returned to Rabaul for fear of further air attacks. The reinforcement mission that was supposed to deliver 7,000 fresh troops had delivered barely 1,000. The 51st Division, intended to strengthen Japanese positions in New Guinea, had been effectively destroyed before it ever reached the battlefield. Allied losses were minimal by comparison. 4 aircraft were destroyed in combat, 1 B-17 and 3 P-38s. 2 more were lost in accidents during the operation. 13 aircrew members died, 10 in combat and 3 in the accidents. The exchange rate was approximately 230 Japanese dead for every American killed. The Japanese High Command reacted with shock and disbelief. Rabaul Staff Officer Masatake Okumiya stated that their losses for this single battle were fantastic. Not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did Japan suffer a single comparable blow. They knew they could no longer run cargo ships or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea, east of Wewak. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, reached a grim conclusion. It is certain that the success obtained by the American Air Force in this battle dealt a fatal blow to the South Pacific. Captain Tamichi Hara, a destroyer commander who would survive the war to write his memoirs, was blunt in his assessment. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable, he wrote. Never was there such a debacle. The Chief of Staff to General Imamura flew immediately to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo with the news. The staff officers who received his report understood the implications at once. If convoys could be destroyed so completely by American air power, then the entire Japanese strategy in the South Pacific was in jeopardy. Their forces across New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Central Pacific depended on supplies and reinforcements delivered by ship. If those ships could no longer get through, those forces would wither and die. The decision that followed was definitive. Japan would never again attempt to land troops at Leh by ship. They would rely on barges, submarines, and small coastal craft for supply operations. These smaller vessels could hug the coastline, hide during daylight hours, and move only at night when the American bombers could not find them. It was a slow, inefficient, and dangerous method of supply, but it was better than losing entire convoys to skip bombing attacks. This constraint crippled Japanese operations in New Guinea for the remainder of the war. Reinforcements that might have been delivered in days took weeks or months. Supplies that should have reached frontline units rotted on beaches or were lost when barges were sunk. Japanese soldiers on New Guinea slowly starved, their food and ammunition trickling in aboard small boats, while American forces received everything they needed through secure supply lines. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea did not end the war in New Guinea, but it ensured that Japan would lose it. General Douglas MacArthur called the engagement the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. He sent his gratitude for one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Washington immediately recognized the significance, understanding that Japanese morale would deteriorate as they came to realize that the Allied air forces were growing not just in numbers, but in skill, training, and daring. The victory vindicated everything Kenney had believed and worked for. Since the Bismarck Sea action had proved the concept was sound, all light and medium bomber pilots in the Southwest Pacific were trained in low-altitude bombing techniques. Pappy Gunn was sent to North American Aviation in California to help implement factory modifications. The commerce destroyer concept he had developed in Australian hangars would become standard production, eventually producing B-25s with 6 and then 850 caliber guns in the nose as factory equipment. Skip bombing spread throughout the Pacific Theatre and beyond. In November 1943, 5 squadrons attacked Rabaul Harbour at masthead height, destroying or damaging 30 of 38 vessels and 20 merchant ships present that day. The technique proved equally effective against warships and cargo vessels, against anchored ships and ships underway. Anywhere Japanese shipping could be found, skip bombers could destroy it. B-26. Marauders adopted the technique in the Mediterranean against German and Italian shipping. The 12th Air Force used modified attack tactics against Axis vessels in the Adriatic and along the Italian coast. Soviet pilots used the 20s for what they called Topmachtovix attacks, flying at mast-top height against Axis vessels in the Black Sea. Variants of the technique were developed for other purposes. Glide-skip bombing proved effective for destroying bridges in the China-Burma-India theatre, bouncing bombs off water beneath bridge spans to bring them down. The Bismarck Sea disaster had altered Japanese strategic calculations fundamentally and permanently. The loss of those 7,000 troops was devastating enough. The loss of the ability to move troops by sea within range of Allied air power was catastrophic. It would shape Japanese operations for the remainder of the war. The men who made this victory possible faded into history after the war. George Kenney became the first commander of Strategic Air Command in April 1946. He retired on August 31, 1951, and spent his remaining years writing about his experiences. His book, General Kenney Reports, remains a primary source for understanding the air war in the Southwest Pacific. He died on August 9, 1977, 3 days after his 88th birthday, in Bay Harbor Islands, Florida. Pappy Gunn retired as a colonel on June 30, 1948. His body was broken by wounds sustained when a Japanese phosphorus bomb hit his aircraft at Tacloban airfield on Leyte late in the war. His family had survived the Santo Tomas internment camp. They were liberated on February 3, 1945, by the 1st Cavalry Division. Gunn was in a hospital in Brisbane recovering from his wounds when his family was freed, but they were soon reunited. He returned to the Philippines after the war, to rebuild Philippine Airlines. On October 11, 1957, 1 week before his 58th birthday, his Beechcraft aircraft crashed in a storm over the central Philippines. Pappy Gunn died as he had lived, flying. He is buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he had spent much of his naval career. The pilots who flew those devastating minutes over the Bismarck Sea scattered to ordinary lives when the war ended. The gunners who swept Japanese decks with thousands of rounds went home to families who could never fully understand what they had done. The mechanics who kept the modified bombers flying returned to civilian jobs, their skills no longer needed. The innovation they had helped create became standard doctrine, taught in Air Force academies around the world. Their names were largely forgotten. What they accomplished should not be forgotten. The military establishment had declared skip bombing too dangerous. The doctrine had been analysed and rejected. The risk had been measured and judged unacceptable. The problem had been examined and declared unsolvable. They were wrong because they stopped asking questions. They accepted the first answer they found instead of searching for a better one. They saw danger and assumed danger meant impossibility. They confused established methods with the only possible methods. Kenney and Gunn asked different questions. They asked whether the danger could be managed rather than avoided entirely. They asked whether aircraft could be modified to change the tactical equation. They asked whether coordination and training could reduce exposure time to acceptable levels. The answers they found transformed aerial warfare against shipping. A hit rate of 1% became a hit rate of 35%. Ships that had sailed through storms of bombs dropped from high altitude were torn apart in minutes by weapons that struck at the waterline. A convoy that expected to lose 4 transports lost all 8. A technique dismissed as suicidal became the standard method for attacking enemy vessels throughout the Pacific. Expertise can become a trap. The officers who abandoned skip bombing after Wilhelmshaven were experienced professionals making reasonable judgments based on available evidence. The planners who accepted their conclusions were following established doctrine developed by people who knew far more about aerial warfare than any civilian. They were not stupid. They were not lazy. They were not incompetent. They were simply wrong. And being authorities, they had the power to impose their conclusions on everyone else. The accumulated assumptions of thousands of officers trained in the same schools and committed to the same beliefs created resistance that almost no evidence could overcome. It took people willing to work outside that framework to find solutions the establishment had declared impossible. Kenney developed his ideas at the margins of Air Corps doctrine when no one was listening. Gunn was a retired Navy enlisted man with no formal military aviation training who modified aircraft because someone needed to do it, and no one else would. The Australian Beaufighter pilots attacked at mast height because no one had told them it could not be done. They looked at the problem with fresh eyes. They found answers that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered by someone willing to look. The men who flew over the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, did not know they were making history. They knew only that they had trained for this moment, that their commanders believed in them, that the ships below carried enemy soldiers who would kill their comrades if they reached New Guinea. They flew into anti-aircraft fire at 200 feet, released their bombs, watched them skip across the water and slam into Japanese hulls, and flew out again through smoke and flame and flying debris. 15 minutes later, the convoy was destroyed, and the course of the Pacific War had changed forever. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.